generally speaking, we play down that lieutenant colonel thing. It's like, if you stay around long enough, they feel sorry for you. The problem with this lecture is the fact that, I was asked to talk about the Civil War in Metairie, and trying to jam so much into one program. It's kind of like, I heard someone say, sounds like they describe it as like trying to describe the theory of relativity using only a blender and a screwdriver. But we're going to plow through this as quickly as I can. If I'm thinking too fast, it's because I want to cover a lot of stuff, and I'm not going into a lot of depth with this. But the truth of the matter is, can everybody see that? Okay. When you grow up if you grew up in Metairie, you know darn well that everybody you ever met told you nothing ever happened in Metairie. If it didn't happen in the French Quarter, it probably didn't happen, right? I mean, everything happened down in the French Quarter. Nothing ever happened in Metairie. Nothing ever happened in Gentilly. West Wego was an afterthought. Nothing ever happened there. Well, what I started doing was, and besides, let's face it, Metairie until after the Civil War was nothing but a big swamp. I heard that all my life growing up. And I grew up right over here, right near the corner of Cleary and West Metairie, when it was still a dirt road, by the way. But what we found, what I started looking at was, I realized I used to ride my bicycle past Camp Parapet, where you have that powder magazine. And it kept hitting me that this made no sense at all, that somebody built this elaborate powder magazine way out in the middle of nowhere, and it didn't seem to support anything. It was just there. Joined the Navy. Navy taught me about explosives, and one of the things you learn about is powder magazines. Then it made even less sense. It's in the wrong place. There's nothing it's supporting. I started getting into it, and it sort of piqued my interest. After the Navy, I went to college, earned a history degree, studying with Stephen Ambrose, who I disagreed with on almost everything. Hopefully we can dispel a couple of myths. No, Ambrose and I, we got along well, we did a lot of things together, but we disagreed on almost everything. Metairie in 1860 looked like this. This is a map. This is the Sauve-Crevice map. It's a map that details where the flooding was in the 1849 flood. And the 1849 flood was the flood that they always judged floods by in this area until Katrina. But you know what? The maps look exactly the same. The map for Katrina. You see here, there's the Broadmoor, there's Holly Grove and Gerttown, and over here is Elmwood. Anybody ever seen Elmwood in a heavy rain? It's a low area. It was a low area back in 1849. It was a low area in 1860. It was always low. Okay? But what you wind up with is the idea that that used to be the boundary between Jefferson Parish and Orleans. The boundary line actually ran down, I think, Felicity Street. That's right along in here, But the Jefferson Parish used to extend all the way to within 6 blocks of where the Crescent City connection is. It took all of that. Okay. This is today's border, just to give you an idea. First thing I want to talk about is, first of all, you see all the time when you see Metairie, you'll see it. If you look up the definition in Google or Wikipedia or something like that, it almost always tells you Metairie means sharecropper. I got news for you. The Metairie Ridge was some of the most valuable land in the entire region. Sharecroppers do not farm valuable land. Sharecroppers are always, they crop poor land because nobody else wants it. This land out here, what you wind up with is that you had a whole bunch of the plantations that used to be large land holdings. They basically were defunct. They couldn't make any money. They're too small, and the land is just too valuable for other things, like for instance growing vegetables. It takes a grand total of 1 hour to get in a wagon that goes 3 miles an hour. You can go in a wagon from like the Metairie Ridge around by City Park. You can go and make it down to the French Market in a matter of 30 minutes. it's a short distance. Nobody's going to grow sugarcane on that land. They're going to use it for something else. There were a lot of orchards. There were a lot of, basically, that kind of stuff. But basically, the real translation for Metairie that would be appropriate would be leased land. A lot of people would go out to the Metairie Ridge. They would have a big, large parcel of land, and they would say, I want to lease that for 3 years, for instance, to graze cattle, or to do something like that. And that's where you get that economic aspect, the financial aspect of farming, and that's why, you know, I hate it when I see that definition. Again, originally, the large hen, they were leasing things out for more valuable things like grazing cows. And again, the older folks in here like me, you remember when there were dairies all over the place. Matter of fact, across the street from my house, I lived on Brennan Street, across the canal from us, there was right at the corner of, what is it now? It's Cleary and West Metairie on the riverside, New Orleans corner. That was a dairy. They had dairy cows walking out in the field there. Again, Metairie was, the area out here was fairly sparsely populated. Not fairly, it was sparsely populated. The big population centers in Jefferson Parish was the city of Lafayette, then Jefferson City, the village of Greenville, which a lot of people don't realize even existed. You see a lot of Civil War documents that have in there that something happened at Greenville, and everyone always assumes they're talking about Greenville, Mississippi. It was the largest cavalry encampment of the entire Union Army at one point was at Greenville. It's right next to Carrollton. It was at Audubon Park. Okay, so when you see Greenville in some document, and it's talking about Louisiana, they're talking about Greenville right next to Carrollton. Okay, just to orient you, this is about where West Metairie, where West Napoleon is, and if you look, you'll see the swamp is north of this. This is mostly tidal swamp. If the weather is right, you get a north wind, you get a high tide. It can flood all the way. It would flood all the way up to about that line where West Napoleon is. People will tell me all the time, "Oh no, it would go all the way to where Airline Highway is." No, it didn't. Airline Highway was dry ground. It sort of explains why did they build the fortifications where they did. Well, this is Causeway Blvd. If you look here, you look on a map, you see that's one of the narrowest necks of land that they've got in this whole area. If you're going to build fortifications, and they really were going to build fortifications, you want to build them at the narrowest spot. It's anchored, one side of it is anchored on the river. One side is anchored on the river, and the other one is anchored on the swamp. One of the problems that they will experience, as a matter of fact, what the Union forces will continue to experience is something that all of us who live in Jefferson Parish are somewhat familiar with: ground subsidence, right? They dug this huge canal right through the middle of the Metairie Ridge along Causeway Blvd, and every generation of Yankee engineers would show up and say, these people before us were stupid. They didn't extend the line far enough. The swamp is way out there. The swamp was way out there because they kept lowering the water table. They were draining the low areas in Metairie. Because you see, over here, you're anchored on the river, and over here, you're on the swamp. You only have to build a relatively small line. And that's why. The other thing that keeps it from going was the politics of things. One of the things you don't realize, people don't realize, is that Jefferson Parish was relatively sparsely, even with the cities in it, like Carrollton and Jefferson City. Jefferson was not that populated. New Orleans had about 160,000 people in it. Jefferson Parish had 15,000 people in it. There were about 350 free people of color. That is really unusual. New Orleans had 11,500. All right? There should have been a lot more, and the reason for it is that's one of those other things that you start to wonder. You look at it and go, this doesn't make any sense. Was the idea of they do have about 5,000 slaves, but I could never find them. I would look through all of the census data. A big concentration of slaves is the Meladon plantation, and they have 147 people. Some of the larger plantations you see up the river might have 1,000, but he's only got 147. Most of the holdings in this area, the people there, they're all servants. And I think a lot of those people were effectively free, but they were technically slaves. And the reason for that was because the laws prevented you from freeing slaves. You couldn't just say, hey, Joseph, you really did a good job for me, I want to free you. If you freed him, you had to put up a bond. By a law passed in 1859, they passed a law that said if you free a slave in Louisiana, you have to put up like a $5,000 bond, and you have to guarantee that he's out of the state in 45 days. If he has to leave the state, he has a wife and children. What happens to them? He has a livelihood where he is. You know what you do? You say, Joseph, I'd like to free you, but I can't. So what I'm going to do is I want you to act, just make all the decisions on your own, raise your family, grow these crops for me, tend these orchards for me. We'll put money aside for you. And that was happening a lot. Leon Godshaw, the guy who actually ran Godshaw, created Godshaw Sugar and the department stores. Leon Godshaw was Orthodox Jewish, and he abhorred slavery. But he had a friend of his that was a slave, and when he found out that the slave, this was upriver, when he found out the guy who owned him, who was a friend of his, died, he rushed up there. He bribed the sheriff, and he bought Joachim Tassin. He bought him, brought him back to New Orleans, and then he told him, don't ever tell anybody you were a slave. That happened a lot. There were about 9,000 plus, white people, and a great many of these people were immigrants. And that was one of those reasons why, when they did the plebiscite to decide whether Louisiana was going to secede from the Union, they put it up to, the vote was by each parish individually. And in Jefferson Parish, they voted it down 4-1. Plaquemine Parish voted it down. St. James, St. John, all of them voted down secession. This was not a hotbed of the Confederacy like you would find like in Macon, Georgia, or Charleston, South Carolina, or Richmond. They weren't there. A lot of people here didn't have a dog in the fight, and they weren't going to get dragged into it. The statewide measure won, but the vote was very close, and that explains why the politicians hit it. And the official results of the plebiscite that took place in December of 1860 was not officially published until the 1930s. They were covering it up because it was so close, right? But once the decision was made, the men of Jefferson and I guess their wives and their families all sort of joined the Confederate cause, and they enlisted in rather large numbers. Why did it fail here? Well, because a great many of the people who lived in Jefferson Parish were Germans. They were recent immigrants, and a lot of these people were 49ers. And the 49ers were the people who left Germany when the whole continent was convulsed in revolt after revolt after revolt, and almost all of them were put down, some of them rather bloodily. A lot of these people decided, I'm out of here. If they won't get rid of the king or the duke or the prince where I live, I'm going to go someplace where they don't have dukes and princes and kings. And a lot of them came to America. They brought their politics with them. And their politics was definitely somewhat strange. They were anti-slavery. They believed women should vote, of all things. Imagine that. Women voting. My God. But they had these, these were the people who were there voting for all this stuff, and they voted against it overwhelmingly in Jefferson Parish. Majority of residents living on the left bank, and the left bank is what they called this place. Nobody ever referred to a place called Metairie. They never called it Metairie. In all of the documents I've ever seen, no one ever says they live in Metairie. They live on the left bank. You live on the left bank. After Camp Parapet was established, the entire population of this area referred to themselves, I live at Camp Parapet. That lasted until like 1911. The word Metairie doesn't start to appear until the late 1920s. Now you see Metairie Ridge, Metairie Nursery, Metairie Racecourse, Metairie this, Metairie that, but it's always attached to something. But nobody ever thinks of this area where we're sitting right now as Metairie until the 1920s. This is what happened when the city fathers of New Orleans, not Jefferson Parish, by the way, the city puts together a committee for public safety, and they start coming up with ideas about how they were going to defend the city, because now we've seceded from the Union, and the Union has a big navy, and we don't have anything. The Confederates had no navy what to speak of at all. And the only thing they were going to rely on was they had those outlying forts, what they called the outer defenses, was Fort Jackson, Fort Phillip, Fort Bienvenu, Fort Pike, Fort Macomb. All those places, the outer masonry forts, were designed for keeping an outside enemy, a foreign enemy, from capturing the city. Now, of course, they'd have to defend the city against an enemy that is very likely can come up the river. He can come by way of the West Bank. He can come across Lake Pontchartrain. He can sail up Lake Pontchartrain. He can do all kinds of stuff to get to him. So they came up with this scheme here, and they called those red lines up there are called the inner defenses. And the inner defenses were thrown up at all the strategic approaches, the avenues of approach into the city. And so that's why you wind up with the two down here. This is Chalmette. This is the McGehee line. There's a line at West Wego, which was massive. They built it behind the Company Canal. Big works, lots of cannons. Over here was the main. Over here they started building what the Federals referred to as Fort Banks, and that was at 9 Mile Point. There's not a trace of it left. And over here was Camp Parapet, and Camp Parapet was the main anchor for all of them. That was the biggest thing that they had, and they were because the biggest danger at the time. Remember, at this point, the Yankees are up there in Kentucky and Tennessee and northern Mississippi, capturing town after town after town using their gunboats. There's no reason. Sooner or later, they're going to start coming down the Mississippi River. At this point, they'd already gone through Belmont. They'd captured Island Number 10. They were approaching Memphis. Once they take Memphis, the only other place after that is going to be Vicksburg, Natchez, and then New Orleans. So they built these defenses with the idea. They weren't crazy. Those defenses were put there because they were genuinely afraid that the northern fleet was going to come down the Mississippi River and attack them. So the other one you see over here, this was on the Jefferson Lake Pontchartrain Railroad, what we call now the 17th Street Canal. And that was there at that time. And they had a gun battery there. And those were the ones that were in Metairie, was the Jefferson Lake Pontchartrain Battery, the one in the Camp Parapet, and that's basically the gun emplacements that were there. The guy who designed everything was a really colorful character named Benjamin Pierre Buisson. Buisson began as he was born in France. He went to all the military academies in France, became an artillery officer for Napoleon. He fought in a number of battles. He distinguished himself. But when Napoleon fell, he emigrated to New Orleans. And of course, being a rather astute guy, he married into a very prominent family, which was the Arnold family. The Arnolds had a large holding right near Causeway Boulevard. Gee, why did they build the defenses at Causeway Boulevard? Because the next plantation over was the Arnold holding. He knew the land like the back of his hand. And so he looked at it and says, this would be a really good place to build. This would be the place where we're going to build the fortifications. They didn't bother asking Jefferson Parish, by the way. And then it became sort of a long brouhaha between the state and the Confederate government and the city of New Orleans about, okay, who does this belong to? And nobody ever resolved it. But, he was the chief engineer for the parish of Jefferson, and his claim to fame was he's responsible for naming all those streets in Carrollton after Napoleonic victories in significant towns for it, and why, you know, you have all that trouble why we have so much trouble pronouncing all those French names. Well, you can blame Benjamin Buisson. Yeah, he was the guy who did that. Okay, the fortifications, when they built these things, first of all, another great myth, that the slaves built the fortifications. No, they didn't. We have the documents. We know exactly who built them. It was built by contractors. And the contractors, the problem is the slaves were way too valuable to waste them building something like this. When you had all those Irish laying around who were going to be willing to work for 5 cents a day, why in the world would you endanger, you know, your valuable commodity? You know, so they didn't. No, the truth is they didn't. They again, the contractors they hired. There were 3 basic contractors that built all the fortifications, which is why all the fortifications were rather similar. Again, that's Causeway Boulevard today. And that's Airline Highway. So you can see how far this went. The Confederates went just about to Metairie Road. And Metairie Road at the time was a fairly good road. The other thing that people don't realize is that if you look here, Metairie Road, if you look at the Metairie Ridge Road, and that's what they called it, the Metairie Ridge Road goes to LeBar, and then it comes down to the river. And it's actually, on most maps, it actually has Metairie Ridge Road, where what we call LeBar. They didn't change it to LeBar until like the 1890s. But when somebody would say Metairie Ridge Road, they were talking about LeBar. The other thing was, the upper fortifications, originally they were called, they didn't know what to call them, so the newspapers would always refer to it as work going on at the upper fortifications. And there were a lot of other different names and everything, but the name they sort of settled on was the Victor Smith Line. And the reason it was Victor Smith was because the guy who this Confederate government sent down as a chief engineer to oversee what they were spending a lot of money and putting a lot of guns on was a guy named Martin Luther Smith. Martin Luther Smith's son was named Victor. So his son, who was like about 14 years old, would accompany him along the line, and so the workmen started referring to it as Victor's Line. So it became the Victor Smith Line. Line ran from the river to Metairie Road. The Parapet, this was a very large fortification. It was 8 feet high. They dug a 20-foot ditch that was 8 feet deep in the front, and they threw all that dirt up to build the parapet where they could put the gun emplacements on. Now remember, the land that they're looking out over is probably down here by the river is maybe 2 feet high. As you got farther and farther on the other side of the Metairie Ridge, it was sea level. And some of the fortifications you'll see that the Federals built later were 15 feet high. Imagine that. That's higher than Monkey Hill was. People would get a nosebleed going out there. At the base of the fort was Fort John Morgan. It was named after some guy who raided Ohio. I don't know why they named it after him. But they had 9 really heavy guns. We're talking about like 32 and 42 pound guns in here. And, oh, that's the wrong one. Where is it? There it is. And that's probably what along the line it would have looked like with the guns that were on field carriages. And the largest gun you can put on a field carriage is about a 24-pounder. And so a 24-pounder, though, has the ability from, if you're going to be firing that thing from, say, Causeway Boulevard, a 24-pounder can easily reach Clearview. All right? So it covers a really wide arc. All right? And most of the guns that were in this thing were heavy guns. The problem is they didn't have the right carriages for them. A lot of these guns were mounted on naval carriages, which made their mobility very limited. This would be a shot here, but what it would look like when the Federals were in charge. Confederate units that came from Jefferson Parish, if you track them down, a lot of the men from Jefferson Parish entered units. Unfortunately, we don't know whether they were from it because every one of them is listed as being Orleans. Booth, who did all the work on most of the identified through Confederate records, and he put together a really interesting book that lists all of the Confederate units, all the Confederates. They're listed, all the units are listed, no matter where they're from, they're listed as being from Orleans, unless they're from St. Helena Parish or they're Baton Rouge. Everyone in this area is all listed as being from New Orleans. So you can't really tell. What you have to do is first of all, you can look at the names of some of them. But the other thing is you can also look at where the commanders came from and where a lot of the men were enlisted from. And if it says they were enlisted from Jefferson City or from Gretna or from Kennerville or one of those places, then you can pretty sure that most of the guys who are in that unit are from that area. Because they did recruit from, they called them, in World War I, they would call them the Friends Battalions, where friends joined up. Problem with that is one artillery shell comes down and you can kill off an entire village. You can kill an entire family. And that's a lot of times what happened. The big unit that was in New Orleans, that was from Jefferson Parish and served in the war, was the Jefferson Mounted Guard Cavalry, colloquially known as Drew's Cavalry. It was Captain Guy Drew was the sheriff of Jefferson Parish, and this is the kind of guy you want to hang out in a bar room with. I mean, he's like this is my kind of guy. He's the sheriff of Jefferson. He was a judge in Gretna. He became the sheriff of Jefferson Parish. He talked the parish police jury into putting up all the money for his unit. And so you've got all these different units, and Guy Drew is involved in everything, and they're putting up the money for it. A lot of the other units are having to have cupcake sales and stuff. I mean, he just goes to the parish council and says, "Hey, give me $2,500 for the Jefferson Mounted Guard Cavalry," and they would, of course, give it to him. Of course, you understand, just like today, the sheriff of Jefferson Parish is also the tax collector. So it's not like he was short of money. Basically, this was an elite unit. It was made up of planter sons. They had very specific details about the size of the horses, the fact that you had to have the right kind of boots, you had the right kind of accoutrements. These guys were well off. And you'll see names, and the names that appear is LaBar, Arnold, the Preston family, the Cagnalotti family. Cagnalotti was one of the richest families in Jefferson on the East Bank at the time. And one of their sons, Adolph, actually joined the Drew's Cavalry when he was 18 years old. He made it out of Jefferson Parish, snuck through the Yankee lines, made it to the North Shore, made his way up, and he joined Drew's Cavalry towards the end of the war. And then he was killed right a couple of weeks before the war ended. The richest guy in Jefferson Parish, son, died in Drew's Cavalry. But mostly what they did was they were headquarters company for the Army, for the headquarters for the Army of the Tennessee. It was General Beauregard at the time. And they would run dispatches. They would send these guys out. If the general was sitting there and said, wait, what's that out on the horizon? He'd send one of those guys out there, a galloper out, to go check it out. And sometimes it'd been riding across in a battlefield. And a number of these guys were killed. A lot of them were wounded. A lot of them wound up dying really early in life because of the stuff that they had gone through. The other unit was the Jefferson Rifles. This one was led by Guy's brother, Jules. By the way, Guy Drew's brother, Charles Didier Drew, who was also a very prominent attorney. All these people are attorneys. He wound up being the first senior officer in the Confederacy to die. He was leading a patrol somewhere. Why a lieutenant colonel would be leading a patrol is beyond me. But he was having fun. I'm sure he was. That's what I would do. The other unit that really had a colorful record was the Jefferson Cadets. Jefferson's Cadets, when they formed these guys up in a meet of all places. It was called Camp Pulaski. Most of the soldiers that came from this area or from the entire state went to either Camp Moore and Camp Chippewa, or if they were destined for the defenses of New Orleans, they were at Camp Lewis, which was the golf course of Audubon Park. All right? So, but these guys were sent up to Fort Pulaski, and they formed them into what they called the Polish Regiment. It was technically it was the 14th Louisiana Volunteer Infantry. And so they did all their training, their organization was at Fort Pulaski up in Amite, and then these guys, they must have been hellraisers, because on a train going to Virginia at Grand Junction, they got off, they stopped for, you know, for the night. They stopped there, a bunch of them got drunk, they rioted. The Franco Rifles, which was part of the 14th Louisiana, they were so riotous that they wound up disbanding the unit. They cashiered the officers. 5 men were killed in the riot, and I was like, oh wow, you know, these are the kind of guys that you want to have in a battle. Right? So, but they did. As a matter of fact, they wound up. They participated in almost every major engagement in the Civil War. They were if there was some fighting going on, the 14th Louisiana and the Jefferson cadets were there. And of course, it took its toll on them. They wind up effectively, the Jefferson cadets were effectively wiped out at the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse. Spotsylvania Courthouse was one of those engagements they started when Grant first took over the Army of Northern Virginia. He didn't take over the Army of Northern Virginia, he took over all of the armies for the Union. He attached himself to the Army of the Army of the Potomac, and then he started doing battles. They fought the Battle of Wilderness, they got whipped. Grant said, we'll go hit them again. So they hit them again, they came down, and then they moved about 20 miles down the road, and they went to Spotsylvania. Spotsylvania was one of those places where they were hemmed in. Lee's there, he's facing Grant. They wound up locked in a battle. They came up with a scheme, said, listen, let's not, when we attack next time, no preparation. We're not going to let the bands go out. We're not going to unfurl the flag. Nobody's going to start cheering. We're not going to dress our line. When I give the signal, I want everybody to just charge across the field as fast as you can, get off amongst them, and drive the Confederates out of the line. Middle of the night, driving rainstorm, the Jefferson cadets are there at this point where they're attacking, and they're hit from 3 different sides, and this was the melee that took place. In the middle of it, it was, someone said, it wasn't whether you were willing to risk death, it was whether you were willing to accept it. Because everybody who went and was sent up to the front didn't come back. There were no wounded limping back. They weren't carrying litters back. Everybody who went up, they either stayed there and fought or they died. And that was what happened, and that's basically what happened. The unit ceased to exist for all practical purposes. They were either captured, dead, or they were in a hospital. And one of the cool things I found once, it was at the Smithsonian, I'm walking along and I see, and there's this tree trunk sitting there. It's all chewed to bits, looked like beavers had eaten it. The story behind it is that this was a 21-inch oak tree that was on the middle and at the battlefield right where the Confederate lines were. And the Confederates normally would have chopped this down and put it on the defenses. But it was such a nice tree, it was providing them shade, so the soldiers left the tree up. In the middle of the battle, somewhere along the line, the tree falls down. After it was all over, the Yankees won the battle. They drove the Confederates out. They're over there. Somebody's looking at it, and they realized the tree had been chopped down by musket fire alone. Imagine how many musket balls it takes to chop down a 21-inch oak tree. So they saved this thing. They put it in the Smithsonian, and go, all right. April 1862, Admiral Farragut, obviously, he makes it past the forts. He goes and he fights his way past the 2 gun batteries along at Chalmette and McGehee line. It's a formality. There's no way in the world that the 9 guns at Chalmette and the 5 guns at McGehee line are going to stop the entire United States Navy. This is an ocean-going Navy. They've got the most modern guns, they've got well-trained sailors, and they pushed these guys, they fired and fired and fired. Confederates ran out of ammunition, and they made their way across the West Bank through a bunch of swamps and eventually made it away. But when Farragut arrives, he deployed all of his ships along the Mississippi River basically from Lafayette Street down to the Mint. That's where he placed his what they call the steam frigate armed frigates. These were the battleships of the time. So picture like 5 big battleships anchored right along Waldenburg Park along there. They sent a smaller second-class ship, the Oneida, up here, and they took possession of Metairie. They took possession of the fortifications at Metairie because they had heard about this. Farragut knew everything about what was going on because you got to remember, the other thing people don't realize, Admiral Farragut, the guy who captured New Orleans, had lived until he was 5 years old. He lived in a camp on Lake Pontchartrain. Go figure. His father was a sailing master, and he was given the job of sailing ships through the Wrigleys. And so the family lived in a camp on Lake Pontchartrain until he was 5 years old, and then I won't go into that, but but that's how he made it. And then another family took him in and said, oh, my father's a captain in the Navy, I'll take the boy along and he'll be a midshipman and we'll raise him to be a naval officer. Farragut spent a lot of time in New Orleans. His sister lived in New Orleans until like 1857. And then she moved to Pascagoula, where her husband became a gun runner for the Confederacy. So, like, okay. So Farragut knew everything about this place. What they found was the guns had been spiked and all of the carriages had been burned. And the person who did it was 18-year-old Leontine Arnold Drew. Like, what? Oh, yeah. Her obituary, this was Mrs. Drew. This is Mrs. Drew. This is a picture that was, this is a picture of Mrs. Drew in her obituary. There's no photograph of her when she was younger. But she's 18 years old. She's living there with her family. She's an Arnold. She's living in the Arnold plantation, which is within spitting distance of the Parapet Line. And she goes out there after she finds out the Yankees have gone past the fort. And she goes out there, and the other Confederates had gotten out of there as quickly as they could because they were afraid of being captured. They left all the guns there. Well, Mrs. Drew goes out there and starts spiking the guns, and she starts setting fire to the carriages. It said in her obituary, it's like 1910, she was married to the sheriff of Jefferson Parish. She was an accomplished equestrian. She was a very good horsewoman. Everybody admired her for that when she was obviously younger. She was living with her family, while her husband was away at the war. And she helped spike the guns at the Victor Smith line. And throughout the war, she secreted messages in and out of the lines. Because she was a pretty girl, she could bluff her way through a lot of Yankee lines. And so she was carrying messages back and forth to the Confederate Army, and she was spying on the Yankees and bringing messages out and everything else like that. When the Federals took over Metairie, it was the Army of the Gulf under General Benjamin Franklin Butler. And people's opinion of Butler is if you admire Butler, then that's what he looked like. But if you're from New Orleans and you were raised in public school or in the schools, he was a hyena. He was both. The truth is, Butler, I've done a lot of work on Butler, and I'm going to be doing a lot of my presentations on Butler at the Civil War Museum. And Butler was a complicated, in fact, I'm not saying I would want to spend a lot of time with him, but he was sometimes he could be a rapacious monster, but other times he was it's like watching a cat with a mouse. He would play with things. He would do things. He was a consummate showman. And most of what he did was being a showman. And a lot of times when he was faced with strong, determined, right women, he would bluster, he'd call them names, he'd do everything, he'd tell them no way in the world, and then he would give in. Butler almost always gave in. The other thing with Butler is, think about this. Anybody, show of hands, how many Confederates did Butler kill? Anybody? Anybody? One. In the entire time he was here, he killed one civilian. He hung Mumford. He killed at least 27 of his own men in the 7 months he was here. Because he absolutely refused to allow his troops to molest the civilians. If the civilians were cooperating, you left them alone. And that was Butler's mantra. If you cooperate with us, we leave you alone. take the oath of allegiance to the United States, get a permit, you get to go. You can ride the streetcars, you can buy anything you want, we'll help you, we'll do it. But you got to take the oath of allegiance to the United States. That's why in this area you never hear stories about them burning people's barns. They never burned people's barns. There were places along the river where gunboats, somebody would shoot at a gunboat, the gunboats would pull over there, they'd blast the heck out of the plantation and burn it to the ground. But they didn't do that for regular people. You cooperated with the Yankees. If they took your stuff, they were going to give you a piece of paper. You brought it down to the quartermaster, and the quartermaster would compensate. Now, he didn't give you what you thought was the full value. He's going to give you the Army value. But that's how they did it. And you don't wind up with those stories around here. The only towns they actually burned was Grand Gulf and Donaldsonville. And they did a real good job on Donaldsonville. They blasted it, and then they burned it to the ground, and then they sent troops in and they broke whatever wasn't burned down or broken. But when Butler arrives here, he arrives with 14,000 well-armed, well-fed troops. And he's got 14,000. That's more. He had more troops than there were all in all of Louisiana at the time. And they only got stronger after that. When Butler left, he had about 24,000 men. And Butler was only here for 7 months, by the way. He did all of that bad stuff in 7 measly months. But his army was divided into 3 brigades. One was the first brigade was under John Walcott Phelps. And his headquarters were in Metairie, right there it was in the Forte Mansion that was right on the river, right near where Camp Parapet is today. It was really right between Causeway Blvd and Main Street. I think Ochsner now owns all of that. I don't know I'm expecting at any moment for Ochsner to call up, want to buy my house. And I live in Old Metairie. But Phelps was a Vermonter, and he was a curmudgeon of all curmudgeons. And Butler's comment about Phelps was he was as mad as a March hare when it came to the Negro issue. And they had a lot of problems, and that was one of those things. And where we get that from was Frederick Douglass, who was one of the great abolitionist leaders of the country at the time. And he put out he had a newspaper that he published, it was a magazine, and he published that newspaper. And he had a big bold type across in an article that he wrote, and it was, "What is to be done with the Negroes?" And nobody knew. You had all these people who were slaves, and somehow or other, they had to get amalgamated into the rest of the country. And they didn't have a clue how they were going to do it. And so had half the population said, oh, well, they'll just, if they given their freedom, they'll all leave and go to Africa. Just like if I'm given my freedom, I'll leave and go to Ireland. Come on, are you kidding? I don't know anything about, I've been to Ireland a lot of times, but not where I want to live. But none of us goes back home. Most of these people had been here for hundreds of years. They had to be amalgamated. Phelps was going around freeing all the slaves at the same time that Butler, on the other hand, in New Orleans, who's overall in charge, is telling all of his people, don't free those slaves because we need them to stay on the plantations. Make sure that they're treated decently. We'll figure out what they're going to get paid. We'll make sure that the plantation owners feed them, teach their children, but keep them there because we need them on the plantations to keep working to start building up the economy. Because let's face it, they took over the entire city of New Orleans. Who's going to feed them? New Orleans gets all of its commodities. There's nobody grows corn or wheat in New Orleans. We have to get it from somewhere. All the cattle that we consume come from somewhere else. They were all in Confederate territory. They had to get the economy going, and that was Butler's focus. Phelps, on the other hand, saw this as his holy mission. God himself spoke to John Walcott Phelps and told him, listen, you got to go out there and tell your men to go free all the slaves. So on one hand, you got General Phelps, who's there in Metairie, sending his troops out around Kennerville and all those other places. And every time they saw somebody, they say, you're free, you're free. They were even freeing the free people of color. People go, what, I am free. Yeah, but now you're free. No, I am free. Huh? They didn't understand that because people didn't walk around carrying a sign saying, I'm a free person of color. How did you know? Well, you don't know. So, but the Yankees didn't know that. They didn't know that this place was filled up with a lot of people who agreed with them. Okay? So he sent his troops out. So they were doing all that stuff. So even, so basically, he said he basically ended it all with going back and forth with Butler. He said, I did not join the Army to become a slave driver for the Union. So he offered his resignation, and Lincoln accepted it. After a while, but he didn't have these altruistic motives. This is one of my favorite lines from Phelps. He ran for president after the Civil War was over, and he ran like on a temperance thing. But my favorite line is, he was talking about how this country was not for immigrants. Look at it. The Constitution was framed for a homogeneous people of an American nation, not for a conglomerate of beer-guzzling, Sunday-desecrating, infidel Germans, whiskey-drinking, Pope-worshipping, governless Irish, idle, ease-loving Africans or cunning pagan Chinamen. By God, this country is for white Protestant males, and that's the way it's supposed to be. Of course, the entire Union Army was filled up with whiskey-drinking, Pope-worshiping Irishmen and beer-guzzling Germans. The entire army were made up of those people. Those were the guys. You see those bodies lying on all those battlefields? Turn them over. They're Germans. They're Irishmen. They don't have signs, but that's what they were. They were the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Nope. And this is the enemy. This is a guy who was actually here in Metairie. He's Sammy Doble. He was a drummer with the 12th Maine. He came down with them. He landed the same day that Butler arrived in New Orleans. He spent a couple of weeks in New Orleans, but then he wound up coming out to Metairie, and he stayed at the camps in there. This is another shot of another unit. This is the 21st Indiana. And I can actually place, and the reason that we know this is a photograph from Camp Parapet is because it actually says right there, Camp Parapet, 8 miles above New Orleans. It tells you right there on the front of the photograph it was taken at Camp Parapet. And again, that's the 21st Indiana. The people who own this in the photograph is the Sullivan County, Indiana Historical Society. But the interesting thing is I've had that photograph blown up multiple times. If you know what you're looking at right there in the background? That's somebody's backyard on Bar Road. That's exactly what it is. There's a huge, you look over here, look at the size of that, the cistern. That is a big cistern for a house. It's probably some kind of a work facility or something like that. And there's a fence, there's a gate over here. This is probably Bar Road right there, because that's where the 21st Indiana was. So, the Parapet Line looked like this for the Confederates, and basically what you got is at the bottom you've got the Mississippi River, and then it went all the way up to Metairie Road. The Federals, when they occupied the area, the Federals began improving things. They brought in a lot of people. The truth is, for the Confederates, they never had more than a company of men here in Metairie. Metairie was not their focus. The truth is that on any given day, you might have 4,000 men in Gentilly at Camp Benjamin, and you might have 120 of them here in Metairie. Metairie was not the focus for them. They wanted the troops to be in Gentilly, where they could be moved around to counter the Federals landing in the Lake Pontchartrain or coming up Lake Bourne or something like that. So the Federals established a heavy camp, the Camp of the Heavy Artillery, which is really a euphemism for the Black Camp. The Union forces that were here were just as segregated as the Confederates were. And they didn't want to mingle the black troops that they were raising to be artillerists, to mingle them with the white troops. So they established two separate camps. The Camp of the Heavy Artillery, which was really in at the corner of Bar Road and Airline Highway. When you drive down Airline Highway and you go under the underpass right there, you're driving through the middle of the Camp of the Heavy Artillery. The other camp was down, simply called the camp. What's that?
Is that the area where bears are you talking about?
Wait, one time?
Narrows and bears, right?
Yeah, right there by when you go under that underpass, that is where the camp of the heavy artillery was. It stretched all the way from about Airline Highway to Metairie Road, and between Labar and Causeway. And at any given time, you might have, 6,000 or 8,000 men that were living there. One of the cool things was, since they were there all the time, they could do lots of improvements, and they did. They spent a lot of their time improving the place. White troops that would sort of meander up that way would go there, and they wrote glowingly about the camp that they saw. There were flower beds. And then they were playing a game that they couldn't name, but they thought, gee, it's really interesting, where they're running around a diamond-shaped thing, and they're using big wooden staves to hit a leather ball. And all these guys are playing that game, and the Yankees had never seen it before. There were a lot of ball players here. The other thing that's left was the military cemetery. In the military cemetery, for some reason, they established a military cemetery on the outside toward where the enemy was going to come from. And the only remnant of that left is the Shrewsbury Cemetery. If you look on the side of the overpass when it goes up over the railroad. If you look over on the side, on the Kenner side, you'll look down, there's a little cemetery right there. It's a Shrewsbury Cemetery. That was the civilian part of the military cemetery. In the 1880s, the United States government decided to consolidate all of those small cemeteries that were scattered all over the place, and they brought them up. They gave the families the option: you can either have the remains shipped back home for burial, or we can bury them in a national cemetery. The national cemetery was established at Chalmette. And there's and that's where a lot of the troops that were at Camp Parapet and died and were buried there were reinterred in Chalmette, closer to Rocky and Carlos, I guess. But the biggest thing that the Yankees built was the Cavalier and the Star Redoubt, and this is the close-up of it. And this basically is, if you know where that barbecue place is on Causeway Boulevard, there's a Moe's. Is it Moe's? Moe's is like right there. This is 47th Street. You can see that's Causeway. That's Southwest Metairie. Okay. The other cool thing is this is White Street. That little white. And the cool thing about that was I had the opportunity. I went to the National Archives, and this is the original drawings. It's enhanced by me, so it was more readable. But what you find is that if you look up here, you'll see this is the elevation. Notice this, they're talking about this thing being 12 feet high. And again, if you go 200 feet in any direction, you're back at sea level. That's how this thing sticks out. And you can imagine this thing being there. You could have seen this thing from all over the city of New Orleans. It was that big, it was that massive. And the really cool thing was I had the opportunity to talk to a guy named Mr. Fred Overmeyer. He was 92 years old at the time. He died about 4 years ago. But I talked to Mr. Overmeyer, happened to be going down the street, and I was looking at him. It was like something was really unusual. His house was way up here, and the other houses are way down here. And so guy was cutting grass, said, hey, I started explaining what I was doing, what I was looking into. And he said, oh, you need to talk to my father. Walked me into the kitchen. There's Mr. Overmeyer and his wife, Lucy, I think it was, and sat down, talked to him for a couple hours. And Mr. Overmeyer said, right after World War II, he went out there and was going to try to buy a plot of land in Metairie, moving from the city. So he shows up there, he looks over, and there's a giant hill sitting there. And the real estate agent said, well, is that? That's like an Indian mound. He goes, nope, it's an old Confederate fort. It wasn't, it was a federal fort. But he says, yeah, maybe you can explain something to me. He says, there used to be a ditch that ran diagonally away from my house and ran over back towards Causeway Boulevard. He was talking about that moat. He actually saw the moat. And he said, at the time, there was a guy on a bulldozer filling the moat in. And I said, he saw the damn fortifications. He actually experienced them. And then, unfortunately, he died a couple of years after that. But when Mr. Overmeyer said when they had the 47 flood and everything else, he said my wife and I lived on an island. It was water everywhere, going all the way, all around him and everything. And there he was living on top of that hill that was put there by thousands of workers carrying bags of dirt to build that fortification there. This is another important thing in Metairie is the, you see this map here is the depot of Army stores. This is actually, if you look here, that's St. Catherine's, that new building they put up on Metairie Road. The other thing you have here is the military railroad. That's not what people would say, oh, that's where the railroad is today. No, it actually followed the contours of Metairie Road. And it really, if you're familiar with it, probably went down Crestmont. And the railroad ended right there, probably at Glenwood Street. If you go to Glenwood Street, if you turn off of Metairie Road, look to the left and look at how high the land is right there. It is unusually high. And you could go all over the place and you won't find anything like that. I think it's that high because that was where the depot was. And the other thing was, another piece of information, lady who was right down the street, I was out walking my dogs in the morning, saw this lady, started talking to her, and she said, you know, that's interesting, because right over there, my father said in the 1930s, they dug up a bundle of military rifles that were all rusted, and they were buried right there at the corner of Crestmont and Glenwood. I'm like, okay, I could never find those rifles anywhere. And the other thing is that the other fortifications were over here at the what we call the 17th Street Canal and what they would have referred to as the Jefferson Lake Pontchartrain Railroad. And again, that was the place where they put up they had a 2-gun battery that was there to try to prevent anybody from coming up using the road that ran along on side of the railroad. The canal at the top was a very shallow little thing, and later on it became the 17th Street Canal. The Yankees did some really weird things here. They used to do, when the ships would leave New Orleans, they would do target practice at what they call the tree line in Metairie. And if you can imagine, I started looking into this, and the reason I knew this was because there was a report, 14th Rhode Island had an artillery guy was standing on the parapet, and he was killed because they fired a shell over his head, and it blew, and the shell was too close to him, and it went off prematurely and killed the guy. And I'm like, okay, where would that possibly have been? They don't want to fire over their own men, okay? So the boat has to be there. That's Ochsner Hospital, by the way. This is the gunboat coming along. The only place you can fire would be right through that little narrow little spot, because the rest of the time, there's lots of people around here, and there's lots of people here. So you got this little thing. So I started looking at it, triangulating it out and everything, and I realized they were shooting at my house, and they're shooting at my house at around Cleary and Civic Street. That's where it actually ends. That's where that is if you plot it out on a modern map. So it was like, man, all that time I was there, we used to dig up in my backyard. Our backyard used to find bundles and bundles of square nails, but we never found any shell fragments. There's another really interesting thing. Real quickly, Mary Lincoln's tie to Metairie. Mary Lincoln, her mother died when she was 14. She helped raise some of the children. Her father remarried, and he had children with another woman, and she helped raise 2 of those things. One of them was Sam, the other one was Alex. Sam moved to Metairie when he grew up. Sam moved to Metairie, went in the cotton business, and Alex remained there in Kentucky. Both of them were young boys when she knew them. When the war began, almost all of her step-siblings joined the Confederacy because, again, they were from Kentucky. Sam enlisted in the Crescent Regiment in New Orleans and went through a bunch of different battles. Alex joined the 1st Kentucky Cavalry. This was a bad year for Mrs. Lincoln. Sorry about that. But Mary Lincoln's 11-year-old son, Willie, died from typhoid fever in the White House in February of 1862. A couple of months later, Samuel died at the Battle of Shiloh, fighting for the Confederacy. And then in August, Alex died at the Battle of Baton Rouge. So she had 3 people she was very close to, and it pretty much drove her over the edge. She went into mourning. She was bedridden for a long period of time, and it caused a lot of consternation in the government because there was the president's wife, grieving, they thought, because of the Confederates. You know, so he had to work a lot to get around the problem with that. A few years later, she was sitting right next to Lincoln when he was killed by John Wilkes Booth, and it pretty much sent her into whack land. And Mary Todd, she confided to her sister that it always comforted her late at night because Todd would come and talk to her, and that was comforting to her. Okay, another person that tied to Mary Lincoln was clearly Cecile Royer Todd. She married Samuel Todd, and they both lived in a house on River Road, right there near Deck Bar, and where Deck Bar meets the river. They had a house there. Now, by all rights, since Samuel was in the Confederate Army, by the confiscation laws that the Federals were following, they should have confiscated her house because they weren't paying the taxes, they weren't doing all the things, whatever. This lady was living there. Well, the Yankees that were at Camp Parapet, which is only a couple of 100 yards away, they knew all about this. And they sent a delegation over to talk to the lady. They told her, we'll never do anything to this place. Keep it. You're on your, we'll put a guard to watch it. And they did. The property was never molested in any way. But she was, she stayed in her home. Hundreds of troops passed by her house every day because the other big encampment for the Federals was in Audubon Park. So there were thousands of men at Camp Parapet in Metairie, and then they also had a couple of more thousand that were at Audubon Park. That was the 2nd Brigade was there. After the war, she got a job working for the U.S. Mint, and she oversaw stamping of coins. The other last thing was I want to talk about it was the Contraband Camp. And the Contraband Camp, General Butler was the guy who coined the phrase Contraband Camp because they didn't know what to call the slaves because the slaves were not technically freed. Right? When they took over, the prevailing law of the land was that slavery was legal in the United States. Remember, while all this is happening, there are 4 states that are fighting for the Union that are slave states: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Lincoln can't drive them into the arms of the Confederacy by openly declaring that we're here to fight for the slaves. So to Lincoln, he had to hold on to that. He was working on how we were going to accomplish this. But at the time, he couldn't just come right out and say it because then those 4 states would have bolted for the Confederacy. So he coined the phrase contraband, and that was the term for a slave that was no longer under a master, but was now with the Union forces. All right, and with Phelps running around the place, sending his troops out to get these people up. Even people who didn't want to come, they were forcing them off of the plantation, and now they only have one place to go, and they were sort of setting those guys up in the Contraband Camp, and the Contraband Camp was right there and right in the middle of the parking lot at Ochsner Hospital. That's exactly where it is, okay? So when you go by there, you look over there, picture hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tents, the sanitary commission there, the teachers are there, doing all kinds of stuff, trying to bring those people who have never owned anything, teaching them money, teaching them budgeting, teaching them how do you make a contract, those sort of things. Remarkable how it worked. I've got this book out. This is kind of tricky because the publisher talked me into doing book number 2 before I did book number 1. I have book number 1. I started realizing when I had the thing, I was there all of a sudden, I started counting. I said, boy, I've been writing this for a god-awful long time. And I said, let's see what it looks like as a book. So I found a program. It converted it over into book pages. And it was 1,800 pages. And I was like, what is this? Like the rise and fall of the Third Reich? The U.S. naval operations in World War II? Oh, man. So when I started talking to the publisher, he said, look, you got 3 books here. Do the second book first because it covers the period of Butler. And that's when most of the stuff in New Orleans and Metairie happened. So publish book number 2 first. I'm in the middle of editing book number 1. So when you see this thing, it's book number 2, and it covers the period for just Butler. The first book covers secession all the way to Butler arriving. And then the third book covers Banks and all of the subsequent generals after that. All right? So don't be confused with that. And this program is sponsored by the Friends of the Jefferson Parish Library. All right? So I'm speaking, so when I'm doing this for them. Any proceeds that come from the sale of this book that's above whatever I pay for them goes to the Friends of the Library. So basically you're making, by buying a book, you're making a donation to the Friends of the Library. All right? Any questions?
When Beast Butler left here, what was his assignment after he was left?
He didn't have one. He was summarily rejected by everybody. They hated him. Everyone universally hated Butler. Butler was not a fighting general. Butler was not fired because he insulted the women of New Orleans. He wasn't fired because he stole money or stole people's spoons. He was fired because he wouldn't fight. He had an army, a giant army that was sitting in New Orleans, and they were like the Praetorian Guards protecting Caesar. He had 24,000 men in December of 1862. He kept about 18,000 of them in New Orleans to defend the city against a mythical Confederate army that didn't exist.
Well, did he have the 27 men that he killed, did he put them on trial for court-martial, or did he shoot them?
Oh yeah, they gave him a real quick trial. It lasted probably 5 minutes, and they said, you're guilty, and then they hung him. They hung him, they shot him. He killed a lot of Yankees. He sent a lot of people down to Fort Jackson with the idea that, attach them to a 20-pound ball. And they did that a lot. But there were other people where he, again, using that subterfuge that Butler was famous for, he did Eugenia Levy Phillips was a Jewish lady who had a history with the Yankees of being anti-Yankee. And they trumped up charges for her, saying that she was laughing when there was a funeral going by. And so they brought her in, they charged her with treason, and Butler sentenced her and said, you're going to spend the rest of the war, at Fort Jackson, trapped to, in a cell down there. They tell you the boat kept going right past Fort Jackson, went all the way to Ship Island. They put her in the hospital there with the officers. They put her there, they kept her there for 2 weeks, and then they put her on a packet and sent her under a flag of truce to Mobile, where she became a very famous lady. But to her credit, when she was there and they interviewed her, she said, I would never sink to the point where even I would laugh at a funeral of anybody, even if it was the enemy. I would never do that. She could have taken the opportunity to say, yeah, I did it and I got away with it. No, she didn't. She said, no, I never did that. She was a great lady. Anything else? Answered all your questions. My God.
How did the food situation work out? You mentioned they tried to keep the plantations going.
Butler had Butler being the practical person he was, he actually issued a general order. I think it was General Order number 19 and 21. And it said, you can trade with the enemy. They literally traded with the enemy. If you had cattle in Texas and you had a contract to deliver them to New Orleans, they would let you come through the lines and deliver the cattle. They were trading with they had to trade with the Confederates because that's where all the commodities they needed were. As a matter of fact, on the North Shore, they never invaded the North Shore. They raided the North Shore, but they never took it over. They didn't land they didn't establish a permanent position on the North Shore until January of 1865, and they landed 5,700 Union troops at Madisonville. And they built fortifications across from the bayou to the highway, I think it's Highway 22. They built fortifications along there. They had 2 full batteries of artillery. It was a massive force. And at the time, the Confederates might have had 18 partisans running around the North Shore. And they had 5,700 well-trained, well-fed Yankees. One of the great lines of all time was from the history of the 28th Iowa. 28th Iowa had been fighting in Missouri and Arkansas, and they got really bloody. They lost a lot of men. They were tired. The equipment was in bad shape. So they brought them back to New Orleans. They brought them to New Orleans. They put them up in Algiers, sent the veterans home on furlough to recruit and everything. They were going to come back as veterans. They sent the rest of the troops were there for a while, and then they sent them to Madisonville. In the official history of the 28th Iowa states, and we spent one of the most pleasant months of the war working on the fortifications, attending church services, and making the acquaintance of the pretty French lasses of the village. They're over there in Madisonville while all those other people are on those big battlefields being shot to pieces by cannons.
So the war was, oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
The war was still going on when Butler was here. I always thought it was with Reconstruction. But
No. Butler actually conquered the city. Farragut only arrived with the Fleet Marine Force, and he only had about 250 Marines with him. You couldn't take over the entire city with it. Butler arrived, and Farragut spent all of his time, he spent 5 wasted days trying to convince the mayor of the city of New Orleans to surrender. And the mayor kept telling him, we're under Confederate martial law. If you want to surrender, you have to go talk to them. Well, they did. And the Confederates said, we're not going to surrender. We pulled out of the city. We may come back. So Farragut wasted all the time when he should have been going up the river to make it to Vicksburg before they emplaced all those big heavy guns. He lost the race to Vicksburg. That's why Vicksburg lasted for a year longer. It was a year later. They could have walked into Vicksburg. They could have walked in. There was nobody there. They could have taken the place. They couldn't get up there fast enough. The Confederates beat them. The Confederates that were in New Orleans were sent up to Vicksburg to fill out the defenses there.
I don't know if you explained this or not, if you ever said, the last vestige is that mound at Causeway.
Uh-huh.
And my question is, what is that?
The mound?
Is there any other vestige left of the...
Oh, you're talking about the powder magazine down by the river.
Is that all it is?
Down by the river, it was a powder magazine. And again, it says on the legend, it'll tell you that that was built by the Confederates. No, it wasn't. If you look at there's 2 prominent maps that shows in there about a year apart. One of them shows the fortifications when the Federals first took it over, and it shows that mound, the spot where the mound is nothing but sort of a backstop. It's just a wall, a heavy wall that would keep any cannon shot from coming through a sally port, all right? The Federals took that and they reoriented everything, and they took the dirt, they took that dirt and they built a concrete, they built a brick building there and then covered it up with dirt, and that was their powder magazine. And so, but that's what it is, but it was built by the Federals. And I mean, you can actually, in the National Archives, you can look at the plans for the thing. It's exactly what is there, okay? Anything else?
What money was used for exchange when the Federals were here?
The money was always a problem, but you got to remember is that they had just in 1862 had come up with the concept of the greenback. There was very little federal money. Most of the money that was being used was money that was like on a bank. For instance, some of the soldiers were complaining because they were being paid with script that was from the New Orleans-Jackson Railroad. And again, the money was they used to come out with big, thick books that had the pictures of the money to keep people from, businessmen would know that it's not counterfeit. But banks printed their own money, companies printed their own money. They used Spanish silver coins. They used, again, the United States government printed gold and silver coins, but they didn't print paper money. And so the money was based on the actual value. So whatever the value of silver was at that moment, that's how much that thing was worth. Later on, by about 1864 is when greenbacks started circulating in the South. Up north, they were circulated a long time before that. But in the South, you started seeing those appear in like 1864. And it was very controversial at the time because people didn't trust it. Why in the world would you trust? I mean, they're no different from us. Why in the world would you trust the U.S. government? Yeah.
Were there any stockades or Union prisons in Louisiana?
The most strange one was the parole camp, which was in Gentilly. It was at the corner, near the corner of Gentilly Road and Elysian Fields, and it was adjacent to a camp. The Federals referred to that as the Gentilly Bayou Battery. But adjacent to it was a parole camp, and the parole camp was like a prison camp, but it was maintained by the Federals for federal soldiers who were waiting to be paroled. So a federal soldier that, for instance, there was a number of people they did a raid on Galveston. A couple of companies were on a boat. They got there. The first boat shows up. They land the guys on the wharf. They walk right into the Confederates. The Confederates had taken the place back. They walked right into a bunch of armed Confederates, and they were all captured. The other boats pulled up. They started firing. They came back to New Orleans. The Confederates have like 2 companies of the 42nd Massachusetts. Those guys had to make their way all the way across Texas, all the way to the Red River, where they put them on a boat. They sent them all the way down to Vicksburg at the time that was under siege. They exchanged those guys for 2 companies of Confederates that had been captured. They sent those guys over. Well, now they're waiting. Oh, no, they didn't exchange them. They couldn't find anybody to exchange. So they put them in. They had to hold them in prison until they could be exchanged. And they stayed there the entire war because Lincoln stopped the exchange program because they had lots of men and the Confederates had very few. So Lincoln said, why am I trading Yankees for Confederates when the Confederates are going to go fight us again? I can lose lots of Yankees. Andersonville Prison is a good example. But most of those people, they started off with the idea in the early part of the war, they didn't take prisoners. They took prisoners and then they paroled them. All the guys that were captured in New Orleans, all the soldiers that were down at the forts, they let them all go. Every one of them. The only people they kept were the officers. And they exchanged the officers. All the men that were at Fort Jackson, Fort St. Philip, all those places, they told them to go home. Go home and wait to be exchanged. Imagine like World War II, you captured Germans. And, oh, going home. Now, we trust you, you're not going to fight. Yeah, right.
So local friends of Butler would be current day tourist people because Butler was here and it wasn't shelled or burnt like Atlanta. So because it wasn't burnt or shelled, the French Quarter still stands.
Right.
It's one of the oldest cities in the country.
Right. They were this close to being shelled, New Orleans was. When they raised the flag, they put the Marines that came from the USS Pensacola, which was right off opposite of the Mint. They sent a delegation of Marines and sailors. They went to the Mint. They went up on the roof. They lowered the Confederate, they lowered the Louisiana flag, and they put up the American flag, and then they yelled that the crowd was down there, now don't touch that flag. We're on this boat, and we're going to shoot at anybody who fools with the flag. They went back to the boat. A couple of hours later, a couple of drunks, including Mumford, climb up over there. They start taking down the flag. The signal to fire at them was what had happened was all of the guns had been run out and they were loaded, and they were having church services. All the guns were loaded. A petty officer decided, you know what? This is pretty dangerous, having all those guns there and everything pointed at the city. One accident, all of them's going to fire. Every ship in the fleet is going to open up fire on the French Quarter. He goes along and he removed the firing mechanisms from all of the guns. There was a cannon that was up the mast. They brought a small, like a 12-pound brass gun up there. When they started taking down the flag, the sailor was up there, pulled the lanyard, and he fired, and it blasted it. So cannonballs are still embedded in some of the buildings around where the fire station right across from the Mint. There's still cannonballs that are embedded in the walls there. But they didn't kill anybody. But all the gunners ran from the church service. All of them walked over, grabbed the lanyards, and pulled their lanyards and nothing happened because the firing mechanisms had been taken out. But if those guns had fired, every ship along the line would have seen that and thought they were under attack, and they would have blasted the city. That have killed thousands of people.